Before we begin, it is important to clarify something. This lecture is not an attempt to accuse anyone. It is not a list designed to condemn a certain type of person, and it is certainly not an invitation to search for villains in our lives. The purpose of this talk is much simpler and much deeper. It is to ask a quiet but troubling question. Why do some conflicts end, yet somehow never truly disappear? Why do certain relationships drain us the more we try to explain ourselves? Why do we leave conversations feeling exhausted, misunderstood, and strangely diminished despite our best efforts to clarify the truth? Most people approach relationship problems with a very simple framework. We ask, who is wrong? Who is unfair? Who is the bad person here? But philosophy and psychology have been telling us for centuries that this question is often misguided. The real issue is rarely just the person. The real issue is the structure of the relationship itself. Many ancient traditions recognized this long before modern psychology gave it language. For example, the ancient spiritual text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes human suffering not merely as a series of isolated events. Instead, it portrays suffering as something that arises from patterns of consciousness, habitual ways of reacting, interpreting, and transmitting experience. In that perspective, suffering often travels through what might be called a middle space, a space where responsibility becomes blurred, a space where intention becomes ambiguous, a space where no one fully owns what is happening yet. Everyone is affected by it. This lecture is not about changing someone else. It is not about persuading people who may never wish to be persuaded. Instead, this conversation is for those who have spent years explaining themselves, for those who have tried again and again to clarify misunderstandings, for those who have stood in the same emotional place for far too long, defending themselves against distortions they never created. If that experience feels familiar, then what we are about to explore may help illuminate something important. Because the real subject of this lecture is not a difficult person. It is something far more subtle. It is the position that certain people repeatedly occupy within conflicts. And once we recognize that position, we begin to see something remarkable. Conflicts do not always arise from direct hostility. Sometimes they arise from something much quieter, something that appears harmless on the surface, something that sounds like this. I'm not saying this myself, but someone told me. At first glance, this sentence seems innocent, but psychologically speaking, it represents something profound. It is not merely a phrase. It is a mode of existence within relationships. In certain philosophical traditions, including interpretations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a state like this might be described as consciousness without ownership. In other words, a state in which a person avoids becoming the subject of three things. First, they avoid becoming the owner of the words being spoken. Second, they avoid becoming the owner of the emotions those words create. Third, they avoid becoming the owner of the consequences that follow. Instead, they exist between events, like a messenger floating between two worlds, always present, yet never accountable. This position has remarkable advantages. Someone standing in this middle space can always say, I didn't say that. I'm just telling you what I heard. I'm only trying to help. And because of this structure, they can remain inside the conflict while appearing outside of it. To understand how powerful this dynamic can become, let us simplify the situation. Imagine a relational triangle involving three individuals. We will call them A, B, and C. Person A rarely engages in direct confrontation. Instead, A delivers information. A might say to B, you know, C said something about you. Or perhaps, I'm not sure if you're aware, but people have been talking. Notice something important here. A is not attacking anyone. A is simply transmitting information. Now B hears this message. B begins to feel anger, confusion, injustice, perhaps even betrayal. Naturally, B reacts emotionally. Eventually, the emotional reaction reaches C. But here is the surprising part. C may have never said what A claimed, or C may have spoken casually without harmful intention. Yet suddenly C finds themselves in the position of being accused, questioned, or forced to defend themselves. And now the conflict begins. B is hurt. C is confused. Both feel misunderstood, and the relationship between them begins to collapse. But now we must ask the most important question. When the conflict finally burns out, when the exhaustion sets in, when B withdraws and C distances themselves, who remains? Strangely enough, A remains. B leaves out of frustration. C leaves out of hurt. But A is still there, and even more strangely, when the next conflict emerges. A often occupies the exact same position. Why does this happen? Because A never appears to have done anything wrong. A can always say, "I never insulted anyone. I never attacked anyone. I was only relaying information." And technically, that statement may even be true. But if we examine the structure carefully, a pattern appears. Conflict consistently passes through A. Yet A rarely suffers the consequences of that conflict. Instead, the people around them gradually become exhausted. One person burns out through anger. Another collapses under the weight of misunderstanding. Relationships fracture. Trust erodes. But the central mechanism remains intact. This is why the real problem is not simply a bad individual. The deeper problem is a relational structure that continuously consumes people. If we fail to recognize that structure, we often find ourselves repeatedly occupying the same positions within it. Sometimes we become B, the person reacting emotionally. Sometimes we become C, the person forced into defense. And eventually we leave the relationship entirely, wondering what went wrong. But the structure remains. And the cycle begins again with new participants. This is why philosophy repeatedly reminds us of something uncomfortable. When patterns repeat, it is rarely enough to examine the personalities involved. We must examine the system that allows the pattern to continue. In ancient spiritual language, this recurring transmission of unresolved emotion might be described as the movement of karma. Not karma as punishment, but karma as the transfer of unprocessed experience from one consciousness into another. When someone cannot contain their own confusion, resentment, or insecurity, those emotions often migrate outward. They are carried through words, through insinuations, through fragments of conversation that appear harmless, but generate powerful reactions. And suddenly two other people are fighting a battle that may never have been theirs to begin with. Understanding this dynamic is not about judging anyone. It is about awareness. Because once you begin to see the structure, something remarkable happens. You stop asking, "Who is the villain?" And you begin asking a far more useful question. What system is producing this conflict? That question marks the true beginning of wisdom in relationships. And it is also where our deeper exploration begins. Because in the next part of this discussion, we will confront an even more surprising insight. Why trying to explain the truth to certain people often makes the situation worse rather than better. But before we continue, let me leave you with one thought. If you have ever felt trapped in endless explanations, if you have ever walked away from conversations feeling drained despite speaking honestly, there is a possibility worth considering. Perhaps the problem was never your clarity. Perhaps the problem was the structure of the conversation itself, and recognizing that structure may be the first step toward reclaiming your peace. If this reflection resonates with you, consider joining this channel by subscribing and liking the video. Your support helps continue conversations like this, conversations that explore the hidden psychology of human relationships. And now, let us go deeper into the anatomy of conflict. In the previous part of this lecture, we explored a subtle but powerful insight. Conflict is not always produced by openly hostile individuals. More often, it is sustained by a structure of relationships, a structure that quietly circulates words, emotions, and misunderstandings without anyone fully claiming responsibility for them. Once we begin to see that structure, an important realization emerges. The goal is not to change the person at the center of it. The goal is to change how we position ourselves within that structure. And when a relationship cannot simply be ended, when we must remain in the same workplace, the same family, or the same social circle, the question becomes practical. How do we survive inside that structure without being consumed by it? Over time, 3 principles have proven remarkably effective. They are simple, but they are not easy. First, stop explaining. Second, preserve structure and records. Third, minimize emotional reactions. Let us consider why these principles matter. When you repeatedly explain yourself to someone who thrives within ambiguity, you are unknowingly feeding the very system that exhausts you. Every explanation becomes new material for reinterpretation. Every clarification becomes another opportunity for distortion. And every emotional response becomes confirmation that the conflict is still alive. But when those 3 principles remain consistent, when explanations stop, when communication becomes structured, and when emotional reactions disappear, something surprising happens. The person who once found you easy to manipulate begins to experience a new perception. You become, in their internal calculation, a difficult person to use. And at that moment, the dynamics of the relationship begin to change. This leads to an important truth that many people overlook. When dealing with individuals who thrive on relational distortion, transformation rarely begins with them. It begins with you. When your behavior changes, the relational ecosystem changes. Now here is the final and perhaps most important reality to understand. People who operate in this way rarely change on their own. Their habits are deeply embedded. Their methods often feel normal to them. But while their inner awareness may remain unchanged, their behavior will shift if the environment changes. In the language of certain contemplative traditions, the metaphor is simple. Even if consciousness cannot immediately recognize the light, when the light grows stronger, the shadows inevitably shrink. In practical terms, this means that when you stop explaining endlessly, when you reduce emotional investment, and when you establish clear boundaries, you are not merely protecting yourself. You are quietly altering the architecture of the relationship itself. And yet, even after such a relationship ends, something curious often remains. Many people report the same experience. They say, "It's over, but I still think about it. The conversation keeps replaying in my mind. I understand what happened logically, but emotionally I still feel unsettled." This reaction is not weakness. It is not immaturity. And it is certainly not a sign that you secretly wish to return to the relationship. It is a psychological phenomenon known as cognitive incompleteness. Most conflicts follow a recognizable structure. Someone did something, another person reacted. The confrontation occurred. The situation ended. Our minds can easily process that narrative. But conflicts involving distortion rarely follow this pattern. Instead, 3 things tend to happen. First, the source of certain statements remains unclear. Second, responsibility becomes blurred. Third, the final confrontation either never occurs or occurs in a form that avoids the core issue. Because of this, the brain never receives the signal that the event has truly ended. And when the mind perceives an event as unfinished, it continues, replaying the experience, searching for resolution. This is why people often feel a lingering sense of injustice long after such relationships end. But the feeling of injustice carries a deeper emotional layer. Resentment is not always about anger. Often it emerges from something more fragile, the feeling that one's moral identity has been distorted. After interacting with someone who repeatedly transfers distorted messages, many people experience the same sequence. They tried to clarify facts. They tried to communicate calmly, but somehow they were perceived as the emotional one, or the aggressive one, or the source of the conflict itself. And eventually, a quiet question begins to appear in the mind. Was I the problem? When that question repeats long enough, People begin to doubt themselves. This is precisely why such relationships are so psychologically exhausting. They do not merely produce conflict, they produce self-doubt. Ancient contemplative traditions described a similar phenomenon in a poetic way. Unresolved emotions, they said, leave traces of attachment in the mind. These traces are strongest when three things remain incomplete: unexpressed injustice, misunderstandings that were never clarified, truths that were never fully spoken. These emotional fragments pull consciousness back toward the same memory, again and again. But here is the crucial insight. Those returning thoughts are not signs of attachment to the other person. They are signs that the mind is attempting to restore its own sense of identity. Deep down, the psyche is trying to reaffirm something simple: I am not the person that distortion tried to turn me into. Once we recognize this, another common mistake becomes easier to avoid. Many people attempt to heal by trying to understand the other person's psychology. They say things like, maybe they had a difficult childhood, maybe they were insecure, maybe they didn't mean harm. While compassion is admirable, this type of reasoning can become counterproductive when it occurs too early. From a psychological perspective, this is known as cognitive overextension. When emotional wounds are still active, trying to analyze the other person often pushes our own feelings further into the background. In other words, we attempt to understand the other person before we have fully processed our own experience. And genuine compassion cannot emerge from emotional suppression. True compassion appears after clarity, not instead of it. So the essential work of recovery is not to analyze the other person endlessly. Instead, it involves asking a more honest question. Not, why did they behave that way? But rather, who was I trying to be inside that relationship? Were you trying to be understood? Were you trying to prove your integrity? Were you trying to correct every misunderstanding? These questions are not meant to judge yourself. They are meant to help you reclaim something that was temporarily lost: your psychological position. In contemplative language, this could be described as returning one's consciousness to its original place. You are not releasing the other person. You are releasing the version of yourself that remained trapped inside that relationship. And when that shift occurs, something remarkable happens. The mind becomes quieter, not because the past disappeared, but because your identity is no longer entangled with it. Finally, there is one more perspective worth considering. Many people assume recovery means forgiving the other person or forgetting what happened, but healing does not necessarily require either. Recovery simply means letting go of the internal state in which you were constantly explaining, defending, and proving yourself. Once that state dissolves, the mind gradually regains its stillness, and the conflict that once dominated your thoughts slowly loses its power. Because in the end, the deepest form of freedom is not winning the argument. It is no longer needing to participate in it. If this lecture has helped you see relationship conflicts from a new perspective, consider supporting this channel by subscribing and sharing the video. Not because every viewer needs this message, but because somewhere, someone who is quietly questioning their own sanity inside. A distorted relationship may still be searching for words that explain what they have been experiencing. And sometimes, a single moment of clarity can return a person to themselves.